And welcome back to IndieFest. Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Thompson, the editor-in-chief of the Nevada Independent. Delighted to be here for our 4th annual conference. Thanks to those of you who are watching online. We will be taking questions towards the end, so drop them in the chat now or as the conversation continues. As you can see for yourselves there on the screen, this panel is focused on K-12 education, in specific a literacy topic known as a cute little law in Nevada named Read by 3. I want to talk today about whether Read by 3 works. Is it an achievement booster? Is it poor policy? Is it something in between? We're going to talk about the history of the law a little bit. And I'm joined today by 2 women who have worked in the school district here in Clark County in Southern Nevada for years and years. And I think because both of you have been in the teaching profession so long and done so many different things, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves and give the highlights of your career thus far, as well as telling everyone what it is you do now. And Vicki, we'll start with you.
Okay, I'm Vicki Kreidel. I currently teach reading to grades 1 to 5 in an elementary school, Lomi Hurd in Clark County. I've been teaching, this is my 21st year in public education. I did kindergarten for 10 years in California. I moved to Nevada in 2013. And since I've been in Nevada, I started in 1st grade, went to 2nd, and now I work in a reading center. I also just recently completed the ELAD certification here in Nevada, paid for by Clark County School District, so that I can specifically address the needs of my English language learners that I work with. And I have a master's in curriculum development and instruction with a specialty in urban schools.
Your turn.
And I'm Rebecca Dirks Garcia. I'm actually not an educator. Sometimes it feels like I am, though. I am a parent of 4 kids, ages 28 to 12. I've had a kid in the Clark County School District for the last 18 years. So I've spent a lot of time in the Clark County schools. I'm the former state PTA president, and I administer a Facebook group called CCSD Parents with almost 17,000 members. That is a hub of information and resources for parents in the CCSD district, as well as just really serving as an advocate as much as I can on education issues from the parent perspective, which often I find is not really voiced in the education space as much as it should be. And professionally, I work in the nonprofit space. So I like some of these topics because of so many years in nonprofits. I see the intersection between education and what we're trying to address in other areas of the community.
Yeah, in Nevada especially, there's a lot of, I don't like using the word synergy too often, but there is some between various nonprofits and the education system. So just to bring the audience, both here in the studio and online, up to speed, Read by 3 is a law that first showed up in Nevada in 2015 under former Governor Brian Sandoval, and essentially centers on the idea that if children are not reading at proficiency by the end of grade 3, the likelihood that they are going to be high achievers, both in reading and in education generally, goes down substantially. There's all kinds of data that both does and doesn't support this, depending on how you crunch it. I'm delighted that the 2 of you are here today to try to help me work through that. I do want to just say that this law has been tweaked a couple of times since it was passed. One of the biggest points of contention is whether or not we retain, hold back students after grade 3 who cannot read at proficiency. The law started out with a fairly strongly worded retention clause that was undone by the legislature in a subsequent session. And then I think it was strengthened again in this most recent session, but the language still says that they can be held back, students can be or could be held back, but there are some exemptions allowed in the law. So that's kind of our baseline for this conversation. So the big question is, good policy, bad policy, or something in between? Let's just get some early thoughts from you, and then we'll kind of dig in the details. And why don't you go first, Rebecca?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to say that kids need to learn how to read. I think that's a good goal universally because you need it as a life skill. I think the question becomes, how does it get implemented? And I know, I asked this question to CCSD parents this week. Do you know what it is? What are your thoughts about it? And it was all over the place from parents. Some even didn't know what it is. Some people said it was great because it brought more resources. Some said, I don't understand how it's supposed to be implemented because it's changed with each of my kids. That was my own experience. My kids fell into the generation that were impacted by this as the law was released. I had one who was supposed to be in the phased-in implementation of whether or not they could be held back. And then my current 7th grader is the generation that it should have officially triggered, and then things have changed. So I think that's been one of the hardest parts of it to evaluate whether it's good policy or bad policy, is that every session it seems to have some sort of overhaul, and then how each district, but more importantly, how each teacher and each school implements it is very inconsistent. So the experience of how kids are seeing this law played out in their educational journey is so inconsistent, it's hard to really say, is this a good policy or not, other than the fact that it really isn't necessarily universal enough for us to know.
I think we can all agree as a matter of policy that if you don't have consistent data from consistent enforcement of whatever the law or rule may be, it's pretty difficult to figure out whether something's working. What do you hear from, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Vicki, but Rebecca, what do you hear from parents when it comes to them wanting to have their own input into whether their child is held back? Is there any kind of rule of thumb that you can speak to? Where are the parents in Clark County at on this?
It's really interesting. I always say, because I get this question all the time, what do parents think? And I say, well, there's so many of us, it's hard to say what anybody thinks, because it's not universal. I do think that there are parents who are really concerned about how their kids are progressing. And they ask the question, does this mean my child needs another year? And what's interesting is that oftentimes when it seems to be the parent asking for that there's a real hesitancy. They keep saying, let's push them along, and they'll catch up. Whereas when it's something that the school district wants to mandate, that there's a totally different perspective on that. And I think that that's one of the challenges with the law as well. And I understand this, when you write policy, it's really hard to capture all the nuance of kids and families and teachers and classrooms. But so many of the checklist that's required becomes very impersonal. And you're dealing with 5, 6, and 7-year-olds and families who are trying to figure this out, when some of them, they're trying to figure out what the education system is. And we have so many who are transient. We have so many who not just come from other states, but come from other countries. So you're trying to figure out a school system, trying to balance the needs of your kids, and then all of a sudden you're being told your kid's at risk. What does that mean? And then your kid is being told that. And for a 5- and 6-year-old, that suddenly becomes a really big deal when they know that something's wrong with them. And that's, I think, one of the other challenges that really hit me as a parent when I saw how my kids felt about themselves because of what they were being told because the law got implemented.
Vicki, what do you want to add to this first part of the conversation that hasn't been said yet?
I think what Rebecca's talking about, and when we identify the students, just so people are aware how it happens, in Clark County we do something called the MAP testing. We have MAP testing for reading, MAP testing for math. So when they do the reading test, if a child tests below 40%, that automatically triggers that they're an at-risk reader. What that means from the teacher perspective is I have to send a letter home with the child to go to their parents saying your child is at risk for not reading at grade level and to be retained in 3rd grade. Those letters all go home on the same day. The students are very aware of who's getting a letter because they all go home on the same day with the students. I don't think that's a good thing. And I always know as a teacher, when those letters go home for the first time, you inevitably get multiple messages from parents asking you, what does this mean? Even though the letter explains it, parents still want to talk to you directly about what it means. I think it's unfortunate that we identify students as struggling readers from one standardized test. That doesn't make sense to me. As an educator, I don't measure whether my students are a fluent reader by one test. It's like going to the doctor and taking your temperature to see if you're healthy. Doctors use multiple ways to identify health issues, and we do the same thing with our students when they're struggling. So I don't see it as a
Can I stop you
positive.
right there, and just because I'm curious. So, in addition to that written standardized test that we are all familiar with, right? We all took it in one form or another, regardless of where we went to school in this country or this state. What are some of the other ways that reading proficiency can be and is actually assessed in the school district here or in across the state?
So educators do summative and formative assessments in our classroom, like constantly. As a reading teacher, I screen every single student. I teach grades 1 to 5, so I'll do what we call oral reading fluency tests. So they're gonna read for 1 minute. We're gonna see how many words they read accurately in a minute. We also do multiple tests for phonemic awareness and phonics to make sure that they know what they should know for each grade level, so that when they encounter a text, they have all of the strategies in place to be able to attack the words and read and understand. So there's just multiple ways that we determine whether this child is reading fluently, and the MAPS test that we use, it's an online test, and it's something we might look at the score, but it's not something that we use in the classroom.
So I heard the word phonics. That is how I learned to read a very long time ago. In rural Michigan. And at that time, as far as I know, that's pretty much how every student in the country learned to read. It was a science-based / phonics-based type of curriculum. For some period of time in Nevada, we strayed away from that. Vicki, you shared with me backstage that we are circling back to it now, but not necessarily consistently once again. So tell everyone where we're at now with how much is phonics being applied in the classroom? Is it now seen as, are we back to where we were, that it is seen as the best way to teach reading? And then Rebecca, I'm gonna come to you as a parent and ask you about this as well.
So as an educator, I've been actually teaching exclusively literacy for 4 years. At my school, we're departmentalized. I have always taught phonics. I taught kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Phonics was always a part of, because I see the value and I see how it helps kids. There are some students that can teach themselves how to read without any phonics. Just, they have that ability. Most do not. So I believe in systematic, explicit teaching of phonics. The district has come back around to that as an entire district. So in the elementary schools, and I believe middle and high school somewhat also, we've been directed to use a program called HMH. The problem with Clark County is that it was delivered to us the Friday before school started, and none of the educators had it ahead of time. They didn't get enough training on it. They were handed the stacks of books and the materials and said, here you go, you start this next week. Teaching with fidelity. In fact, some school buildings, I've heard that the area superintendents are forcing the teachers to have the manual in their hand while they teach. So I don't think the rollout was ideal. I'm hearing that there's some good things in the curriculum. I really do think that phonics is going to help. I teach in a reading center. The district has also returned to the Zoom reading center models, and all of the Transformation Network schools, all of them have a new reading center this year. So, and I teach small group reading all day long with, we have 4 teachers in my reading center, and we're all working with groups of 6 students. So there's a lot of small group phonics work and in-class phonics work that's happening this year, but prior to this year, that was not the case across the district.
So Rebecca, I imagine you can come at this topic both as an educator and a parent, and I'll leave it up to you which one you begin with, but how do you see phonics as far, where does it fit in? Is it a good thing that we're it's obviously not a good thing that it was handed to teachers, the week before school started, but assuming that teachers adopt this and start to apply it in their classrooms, is this a good thing for education in Nevada?
Well, I think, like you, I learned to read with phonics, so I expected to see that with my own kids. I also was one of those kids that just learned how to read. And so suddenly I had 3 of my kids really didn't just learn how to read. And as a parent, I quite frankly was like, but I've done everything. I have the books, I have the huge library, 2 of my sisters are teachers. I read to my children every night. We did all the things that I was supposed to do, and still my kids were struggling. And one of the challenges as a parent I had was that there was a real lack of consistency on what teachers were telling me to do at home. There wasn't a standardized process. I had multiple kids, and my 3 youngest are very close in age, so I can see the changes. And that's one of the challenges, I think, is one teacher would tell me, no, you need to concentrate more on the fluency and not necessarily stopping and helping them sound out, because that means their fluency will slow down. And so I got support, but very conflicting answers about what I was supposed to do with my kids. And to a degree, some of that makes sense the longer I've been a parent. The reality is, kids aren't the same. I have neurodiverse kids. I have kids with ADHD, autism, who are also gifted. And their brains don't think like every other kid. So it is a little bit more out of the box in that regard. I have kids who are horrible test takers. So when they take MAP, the result is not good. But if they test individually with a teacher, like Vicki was saying, their results are very different than a standardized test on a computer. And again, think about this. This is a 6-year-old taking a standardized test on a computer. In some homes, quite frankly, 6-year-olds are better than us at technology. I recognize that. But for other families, they purposely don't expose their kids to technology. So assuming that a kid even has the ability to do some of these things becomes a challenge. So I think phonics is really important. In CCSD Parents, it was founded by somebody who, my partner in crime, Andrea, who is a special education teacher and very passionate about reading. And if I don't say the science of reading and she listens to this, she will be upset with me. The reality is we do know that from research, it seems pretty clear that we've missed the mark on how we're teaching kids to read. And this is me as an outsider who's a parent, but it seems to be pretty clear that we need to rethink how we teach kids to read. And that's one of my challenges with so many of these public policies that happen in education. As an outsider, I see kind of it happen and the stress that teachers have as they're trying to adapt. And I see how that impacts my kids, because they see it and I see it. And yet we seem to always want the new shiny thing. And so nothing stays consistently long enough, and we always want something else that might be better. And yet we're coming back to phonics, which is how my 80-year-old mother learned how to read in a 1-room schoolhouse in New Hampshire. She literally went in a 1-room schoolhouse. And so I think that that's where some of this too, if parents are the first teacher, and if we as parents don't understand what the schools are doing and aren't able to properly support it, we're never going to make sure kids have what they need. And if the educators are still trying to figure out what curriculum they're supposed to use or what law they're supposed to implement, it's really hard for parents and educators to become a team to help kids.
Do the 2 of you agree with the basic premise that if there's a struggle for a child with reading, that 3rd and 4th grade is a crucial time in their life? Is it essentially true that if we don't get it fixed by the time they're in 4th grade, that they're lost to us, or is there another way of looking at it? Vicki, why don't you go first on this one?
So statistically, the data does show, I was always told 2nd grade. So I was told if a student wasn't reading at grade level by the end of 2nd grade, there's statistically less than a 22% chance that they'll ever read at grade level. I believe that that's fairly accurate between 2nd and 3rd grade probably. But the problem is retaining in 3rd grade. And I taught 2nd for several years, and I've been telling you 3rd grade is when students start to gel their social relationships, They start to hang out in little packs at recess and lunch. They're developing these close ties with other students, and we're having huge struggles with mental health, even in elementary, believe it or not, since COVID. I cannot imagine what it's going to be like to have, I've seen percentages as high as 40% of third graders in a school get held back and not be able to move on with their friends to the next grade. I don't think that that's a positive thing. I also don't think repeating another year of what we just did that wasn't successful for a child, how that's going to fix anything. I kind of feel like Read by Grade 3 sometimes is a way for politicians to feel like they're doing something, but not talking to the educators to find out what these kids need. And I think what they need is tutoring clinics, more small group instruction. Believe it or not, here in Nevada, when you're a teacher and you go into an elementary classroom, no one gives you a classroom book set. I came to Clark County and was given nothing, not one book for my classroom. I had a used desktop and some furniture, and that was it. There was nothing else there. The Read by Grade 3 program in the beginning gave us some books, gave us a set of books that were appropriate for our students. So kids, when they were done with their work, could go grab a book, and they were excited to see the new books and started to want to read. So I think we should be looking at talking to educators and finding out what do we need to help these students who are struggling readers. They do exist, they're real, but retention, I don't see how that's going to help.
Okay, Rebecca, as a parent of children of many ages and many skill levels in different areas, how do you see this?
I always think it's interesting because we blend everything on these norms, right? That kids are supposed to learn by second grade or third grade. I have a kid who's a baby. He made the cutoff by weeks. So he's almost a year younger than a ton of his classmates. And he is a kid that gelled in 4th and 5th grade with reading. A huge percentage of that was based on the teachers that he had and being able to switch to reading things that he loved instead of things that he was told were at his level, that had no interest for him. And so I think to Vicki's point that I really agree with is I am very concerned that we hold kids back and then put them through the same process that already didn't succeed. And so I think for me, that's really how do we use the funding, use public policy to make sure that reading is absolutely a centerpiece of primary education with tutoring, reading centers, books, all of those things that make sure that kids have what they need and that it is responsive to the neighborhoods that the kids live in. I've lived in East Las Vegas for the last 17 years. I can tell you that when I have these conversations with parents who live in Summerlin and other areas of the valley, what their kids see versus what kids in my neighborhood see is not always the same thing. When we talk about the percentage that could be retained, if you start looking by zip code, I can guarantee you that it's not gonna be an equitable distribution across the valley. And I think that's also what we have to talk about resources. When we talk about curriculum, this new curriculum that got launched, which I've advocated for a long time that CCSD needed standardized curriculum, but at the same time, we have some of the highest need schools have some of the least tenured educators and often have the highest vacancy rates. East Side Las Vegas has some of the highest vacancy rates. You're talking about a long-term sub that who knows what their background is, being like, here, you have a curriculum, good luck. And so that's part of my challenge with some of these things is that I feel like kids are getting punished because adults aren't creating a system for them that works. And we're putting the onus on whether or not you, this little 6-year-old baby, have learned how to read, and yet maybe you've never had a fully qualified teacher in the entire time you've been in school. When my kids were at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, at one point there was 25 long-term subs in an elementary school. And and then we don't give them the resources. They don't have the additional things, and we're just telling them that, oh, by the way, you took this test and you didn't do well enough, so you're not doing good. And yet, and that's, I think, what really frustrates me so often in education policy is that the people who control what we do are the adults, and yet we're putting the responsibility on kids. And it doesn't mean that kids shouldn't be part of the process, especially when they get older. But I also think we have to stop thinking that kids all mature at the same age. Now my 2 high school boys who are really struggling, they would not have made it. They would have been held back, are doing exceptionally well at the number 2 and number 4 magnet schools in the state of Nevada. And that's because they hit their stride later than other kids did with teachers who believed in them. And I think we have to flip the narrative that if there's something to be intervened, that it's not feeling like the kid is the failure.
When we were talking backstage about all of these things, the term efficacy came up, and so that launched us into a conversation about the confidence of a student, the belief that a child may or may not have about whether he or she is even capable of doing what's asked. So I'm going to start with you as a parent. Just give me your thoughts on this, and then Vicki, I'll come to you for a little bit of a different perspective in a minute.
So it's interesting, I learned about this. If people aren't familiar, the school organizational teams are also what was created by a law, by the state legislature, and I've sat on them for years. And during one of them, an elementary school principal talked to me about how the book they were going to read as a team was all about student self-efficacy, their belief in themselves as being so impactful on their educational journey. Interestingly enough, this same administrator couldn't love standardized testing more. And I had a child who really, really struggled. And in the process, it was just one thing after another where they were told they weren't good enough. And it was, over time, I stopped doing what the school told me I should do because I saw the mental toll it took on my kid. And I said, it's not worth me having a crying child and a fight to do something that you've told me is absolutely necessary. And over time, what flipped the switch for him was a teacher who said, I don't care what this says, let's get him to discover what reading is really all about. And in 4th grade, introduced him to Percy Jackson, and he discovered his, love, and it all clicked. And that's one story about one kid, but it was interesting because this educator who introduced me to this concept was also an educator who lives and dies by data, and doesn't recognize that we have to look at that human side. Data is important, quite frankly. Schools need to do their job. I will 100% stand up and say that. There are schools that are not making sure that kids are learning and the data is there, and we need to change that. We can't just continue to allow generations of kids in Clark County or in the state not know how to read. But we have to come back to recognizing again that it's a kid, and in this case, it's a tiny kid. And how do we make sure that we're encouraging them rather than making them feel like they're less than, and making sure that data doesn't become more important than kids. Data walls, which if you're not familiar with that, your student number and your MAP score will sometimes get posted on a classroom wall. And those kids go up and look at it, and they find where they fit with their classmates. And it makes an impact. And the question is that more important than making sure that the kid actually knows how to read?
What do you want to add to this, either this exact topic or peripheral topics, Vicki?
So I started the Reading Center last year, and I had a 5th grade young man who would come in every day and kind of slouch in his chair, and clearly didn't want to be there. And I finally waited till the other students left, and we had a conversation. And I said, what's going on? And he says, reading's just not my thing. He's a 5th grader. And he had been told for so long that he wasn't good at reading and had never found any books that he enjoyed. So I had a conversation with him. I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? He says, I want to be a professional soccer player. And so I told him, do you want to go to college playing soccer? He said, yes. I said, well, then you're going to need to learn how to read. It's a path for you to get where you want to go. So his mother was also emailing me, and I suggested that they look into some sports biographies. And he started to find some books that he enjoyed. I've had kids who come to me, first grade and second grade, who say to me, I can't read. They come to my table. I have to show them that they can, because they've already been made to believe that they're not good at this, so it's not something they want to do. Last week, a parent stopped me in the lobby and said, hey, I think my daughter comes to you for a reading lab. I said, yes. And we talked about her daughter, and she said, for the first time in her life, my daughter has been grabbing a book when we get in the car and reading from home to school every day, because books are now accessible. They weren't before. So we have kids who don't know how to pick a just right book, don't know how to find a book that they would enjoy. And for parents, sometimes they don't even know, go into a bookstore, how do you find a book that's right for my child? So I see these interventions we're doing, like reading centers in Clark County, are ways to help these kids who don't think reading is for them figure out that reading is for everybody. You just have to find the right books. And so that's kind of my passion right now, is to help every child find reading to be accessible.
All right, I'm imagining I don't know how many folks are watching us online. If you've got a question that you have not already dropped in the chat, go ahead. I want to save a little bit of time at the end for one more thing. So I think I might just go to audience questions now. Is there anyone at this point who wants to say anything, ask anything, has a story to share that might enlighten us on this conversation? Okay, we've got someone in the front row. Do we have a microphone available? Okay, talk loud. Go ahead, and if I'll also repeat it for everyone who's listening online. Go. Oh wait, there's a microphone coming to you. There. Never mind. There you go.
This is a comment. I'm a retired high school science teacher, and I agree with everything they've said. I thought maybe I might disagree with the parent, because for obvious reasons, but I so agree with everything you've said. And I just will say that if your child has a long-term sub, they just aren't getting what they need to get.
Would you mind holding the microphone?
Okay.
Do you mind can we have a back and forth?
Sure.
So when I was young, my mother started teaching me to read when I was 4. I'm just sharing a personal anecdote to back up why I'm about to say what I'm about to say. And so, by the time I was in 1st and 2nd grade, I was already reading at a 3rd, 4th, and even 5th grade level. And she said to me, Elizabeth, if you learn to read now, you will be good not just at reading, but every subject you ever study, because reading supports all types of learning. So I'm curious to ask you, as a science teacher, I assume you agree with that, but how much of a difference does it make in your classroom as a science teacher, how well a student can or cannot read?
There are all kinds of things they should be learning in science that require critical thinking. However, all the science testing that is done, and at the high school level, we were using MAPS, also ACT, all of that is a reading test.
Yep.
It's not a science test, it's a reading test. So it is really important.
And I think, just to jump in, we're talking about some of the things that I think we see as kind of flaws or what we hope to see instead. I do think, we have to absolutely lay down the law that kids need to learn how to read. Like nothing, no matter, so I understand the motive behind it, because you're right, it doesn't matter what they take, it's a reading test. And so I think that's where sometimes, though, we get lost in translation, is that we spend so much focus on how we're going to measure whether they read or not, that we don't actually spend the time on how to make sure they read. And And then that's where we get stuck, and it carries with them all the way to secondary, right? Because they're all of a sudden in middle school, and they get far less parent and teacher support in middle school. And it makes such a huge difference.
Vicki, is there anything you want to add on this topic before we move on? I want to give you a chance to chime in if you want to.
Yeah, I think that reading affects every subject, even in elementary. But when we started the Reading Center last year, I started getting math teachers come up to me and say, the kids who come to you are doing so much better in math because they can read the instructions and they can read the word problems and understand what they're being asked to do. So I do think that the Read by Grade 3, in that it put the attention on reading, that's not a bad thing. It made educators start to be able to know which of our students are struggling with reading. That's not a bad thing. But the problem I'm seeing is I'm not seeing additional supports be put in place for the students who are struggling so that we can actually help them work their way out of the struggle of reading and find themselves reading more fluently. So as an educator, I'd like to see more money being put into specifically reading in the state of Nevada so that classroom teachers can have books and we can do tutoring clinics and we can do some of these things that are really going to make a difference for all of our children who struggle.
Vicki, is there a big difference? We talk about individual literacy instruction. We talk about small group literacy instruction. Then we've got classroom instruction. Is there a huge difference between, let's say you have a small group of 4 or 5 students who you've put in a group because you want to get them from wherever they are, up to the next level, versus spending one-on-one time with a student in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, huge difference. I mean, when you think of, like, when I taught first grade in North Las Vegas, I had a first grade class of 27 students. Barely had time to do 1 group per day. I should have had 4, like, rotating groups. So we get very little time to do one-on-one, almost none.
If we did have the time and the money, or say numerous literacy specialists at every school that might need them, are you saying that individual instruction would make a big difference?
I think some students could benefit from one-on-one time with their teacher, but I think small groups of like 3, that's just as beneficial. I do 6, and it's a huge difference for me from going through a classroom full of kids to a table with 6 kids. And I can also send the other kids away and keep one student back for a few minutes if I need to. So just the small group itself, it feels luxurious compared to having a large classroom. And what I like at my school is that I work with the classroom teacher. So if I see something that's really good or growth they're making, or I see something concerning, I can just email the teacher and we work as a team to help. And I even have parents coming next week for parent conferences to talk specifically to me just about their child's reading fluency. So I think if every school worked with a team approach to helping our students do better with reading, I think that the students would show more growth than what we see a lot of the time.
Anything?
Question?
Oh, we have a question. Okay, great.
You all have been so informative. But what I thought I heard was it's not so much that children are not able to read. It's almost as if they don't have enough practice in reading. And you even alluded to it might be because they're not reading or they're not offered material that they would want to read. Is that a part of the problem? And if so, how much of the problem? And what can we do to help remedy that problem?
Excellent questions. Wait, come on up on the stage. You can moderate, and I'll take a break. Rebecca, you go first.
Obviously, I'm not a teacher, but I think, culturally responsive literature, teachers who, we have a big disconnect in Southern Nevada between what our teachers look like and what the lived experience of our teachers is versus our students. And I can tell you, my kids had a teacher who was amazing at the literature she picked out. I still remember when they studied A Long Walk to Water and some of those other things that introduced them to worlds and subjects that were unique and interesting. And my kids responded so much to that. And it was interesting for me because I was like, I didn't read any of these books when I was in elementary school. But she was teaching at a really diverse Title I school in East Las Vegas, and it worked for those kids. But I think there's other teachers that don't make the effort, not because they are purposely being bad, but because, like you said, they're not necessarily provided with those materials. And I also think that's where, when we talk about standardized testing, we have to look at the biases that exist in standardized testing and not just assume that it's this test that works for all kids. But I do think changing the script so that it's something kids want to do, and that's the whole thing with education. We're still using so many education models that are based on societies that are nothing like what we look like. And our kids are losing interest. And the more we push out data-driven policy without recognizing how the kids are responding to it, in my opinion, you see it. I have a son who's like, if I get asked about my ID one more time, I'm gonna lose my mind, because that is what his school emphasizes so much. He forgot his ID, he wore one from middle school and nobody said anything, and he thought it was the coolest thing ever, because he's like, look, they don't even really care if it's an ID for this school. But he had heard that so much this year, more so than something about academic. And there's so many of those little things that are happening in schools that drive me nuts when I hear it from my kids. And that's where I feel like we've really lost our way. I know it's going beyond reading, but it's that same thing that I feel like is pervasive, that we're not paying attention to, like, the goal is for kids to learn. Let's focus on that.
Vicki, to circle back, because I really am very curious about the question the gentleman asked. So in terms of practice, in terms of actual reading time per day, per week, and if you can break it down by age group, I'd be curious about that as well. Ideally, how much should students of various grades and ages be spending reading each week, and then what actually occurs in school from week to week?
So I will tell you that this year specifically, Clark County literally has directed us minute by minute. So classroom teachers have instructional minute expectations. They're told how many minutes they can do for each subject, and the teachers are required to follow that or risk discipline. There isn't really time for them just to pick up a book and read, which is the beauty of the Reading Center, because when they come in my room, you're gonna pick up a book and you're gonna read.
When they come to see you, how many minutes is that?
We do 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week.
Okay. All right, so go on with what you were.
But I think one of the pieces of the puzzle that's missing is what's happening at home for our students. So second grade students come to me and I say, did you ask your parents to read with you? Because if they want to take home like Harry Potter, that's higher than their level, they're gonna need someone at home to help them. And what they say to me is, my parents are on their phone, they don't have time to read with me. Or my parents are playing video games. So we need, I think, families who really wanna prioritize student reading, the children should see their parents reading too. Having some time to, and I'm just as guilty that I never read as much with my students, but the reading should go beyond the classroom.
Yeah, there's data, just to share with the listeners and audience, that the difference in a child's reading proficiency when there is even 1 or 2 hours a week at home spent reading versus 0 hours is literally astronomical. And the data is super clear on this. No one argues about this anymore. If there is time spent at home reading with parents, that student is far more likely to not only be proficient in reading, but in general, academically and in school. All right, we've got another question. We probably only have time for 1 or 2 more, but so go ahead.
Thank you both for sharing your perspectives. Something that's underlying this conversation is what is happening before students reach the end of their grade, and what are the resources and supports they have to go into this. And I think about how there's some national longitudinal research that paints a nuanced picture around reading by the end of grade 3 and how other states have implemented certain policies, and where that nuance comes in is around the resources and supports and what's happening in all of those years before a student gets to the point where you're talking with the teacher and the principal about whether the student should be held back. So to bring in another aspect of where the state's moving in terms of ed policy, there's a lot of work going on around not a portrait of a graduate, but a portrait of a Nevada learner, the skills, the competencies, the experiences that all Nevada learners of all backgrounds should have as they're entering the school system and by the time they leave and continue on. So I'm curious, as you're thinking about resources, supports, programs, activities that can support students' early literacy, where do you see the portrait of a learner and developing these competencies and skill sets early on kind of fitting into this overall picture on supporting student learning?
Vicki, you had words.
I'll be
Go
really
ahead.
so I've participated in the process with the Portrait of a Learner and in the early discussions and focus groups and meetings to help generate that. And I think where it comes back to the same thing, it's foundational, right? If we want kids to be critical thinkers, if we want them to be good communicators, if we want them to come out with life skills that translate into being successful at the next stage, reading's just foundational to that. We have to it's like building a house. If you don't have the foundation, all the other things aren't going to be stable. So for me, that's how it fits in. A lot of those things are higher aspirations in the Portrait of a Learner, but if they don't know the basics, they're never going to be able to reach those.
And also, it's not even just reading. Like when you have your English language learners, you have to do listening, speaking, reading, and writing. All of the literacy portion is the skills that they're going to need no matter what they're going to do. So the Reading Center model, which was created by Zoom and is supported by the ELLD department in Clark County, part of our lessons every day is oral language, listening for understanding, and reading, and we do writing too. So I think we need to make sure that any literacy program includes reading, but it includes all of the elements because those are skills that they're going to need for everything.
We do have time for at least one more. Howard, oh, nope. Oh, wait, Howard, I'll try to come to you, I promise.
Mine will be short. So one of the aspects that I have not heard discussed is the role of school libraries and school librarians as far as access to books. And as a child, I haunted my school libraries. I devoured books. So what is the state and CCSD right now for school librarians and school libraries?
That one's for you, I think, Vicki.
So the district just got a new policy. I can't remember the number. It's 51 something. That's regarding the school libraries. And the goal is for every school to have a robust library with a licensed librarian. Ideally, we want our schools to be teaching library classes to our students as part of the rotation so that they can learn about doing research and how to utilize library books, but also having a librarian there to help students pick a just right book for them is really important. At my other school that I worked at, we had a non-librarian, and my students would come in and want to check out graphic novels, and she would say, you can't check those out, that's not a real book. And I had to go down there and advocate for my students because there's words in it. If there's words in it, it's a real book. They're reading words. Let them read what appeals to them because we want them to fall in love with reading. Once they've fallen in love with reading, half the battle is over because they're picking up those books because they want to, they're motivated. So the librarian is a huge part of us helping our struggling readers do better because then they're finding books that they love.
I will tell you that statewide, it's very inconsistent. Not all districts have them, not all in the sense of it being universal. The policy came about because with budget cuts, more and more schools were putting a support staff member to check books in and out and not having a full-time librarian.
Okay, Howard.
I'll just make this real quick. Vicki, your comment about the student that you wanted to read soccer books, about soccer biographies. I'm more worried about book banning. I mean, I don't want to turn this political, but it's in other states, we're seeing book banning. I don't think we've heard anything here, but I wanted your opinion on all that.
Let me sharpen it up a bit since we are just about out of time, and forgive me, technical team, I might go just over here by just a teeny bit. Is book banning happening in Clark County? What books are on the banned book list?
So we don't have a banned book list, thankfully, not in Nevada or in Clark County. We have already had parents come to schools and ask why teachers are reading certain books. And because there's a certain political organization that's nationwide that just started here in Clark in July. And the last board meeting that I went to, I'm going to be honest, didn't feel safe as an educator. And one of my educators that was with me was harassed while waiting to get into the board meeting. Things are about to change in Clark County. And if we're going to keep our books, our diverse collections of books in our school libraries, we're all going to have to go and show up and fight for this because it's already starting.
Okay, I guess I'll wrap this up by number one, thanking both of you very much for both your expertise and your anecdotal and personal stories. That was, I think, for me, the most illuminating part of the conversation. Great questions from our audience. Thank you so much. And then I think I'd just like to add for everyone here and everyone listening and everyone who watches online next week, our opinion page at the Nevada Independent has become a forum for the airing of grievances and for strongly worded opinions on all kinds of topics, including education and including the one we just got done speaking about. So if you have a strong opinion, please submit an opinion editorial. We will get to it as quickly as we can, but we love to see this type of public conversation and debate on our pages, and so I welcome you to do that, and thanks for your attention. Coming up next, the very last event of the day and of IndieVest 2023, the focus group, a big favorite here at IndieFest. Big issues in election 2024. John Ralston, our CEO and founder, is going to sit down with a group of regular, everyday Nevadans from all walks of life and all political persuasions to find out what they think about the big issues for the campaigns ahead. So stay with us.